Computer recording in progress. Okay.
Because you wanna press. Okay, yeah. That's right. Do a change up. We're going to, since available. Yes. I swear we will get this all figured out easier for your notes. Yeah, today's work, so that's. How are you? That's. Touch that. So. Yes. I'm not wrong. We have many people on Zoom.
We have Abby on Zoom. You can see her right there. Oh, do you need to remove that? Is that going to be in your way?
Oh, no, I don't think so. It's a pretty simple presentation. It's mostly just images, so it won't be a problem. Ready to rock?
Yeah. It's in here. I don't need to give a spiel, so.
Well, hello. My name's Jacob Fritz. I'm the program director for the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project, and appreciate the time to come chat with you all today. I'm here to talk about active management and restoration on the Deschutes National Forest and the work that the Deschutes Collaborative does to help shape that shared vision for what restoration looks like. And so I'm going to start the presentation giving some background on the organization itself. And then we'll move into kind of the fundamentals of restoration. And then I'll highlight some projects recently that we've been engaged in that sort of grounds what I'm talking about when I say like building consensus and building a shared vision for restoration, which can be a little bit abstract. So we'll work through it that way. Okay, let's see. So in order to understand the history of, or in order to understand the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project, we need to understand the history of forest management in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. And you all probably are at least somewhat and probably very familiar with the timber wars, but that's really where the core of what the DCFP is begins. So as a brief reminder, in the 70s and 80s, the Oregon in particular, but the Pacific Northwest and the West was going through a period of high conflict. And this was largely, but certainly not exclusively, focused on the protection or, on the flip side, the logging of large old trees. And while it was certainly focused on the old growth, that bled out into all aspects of forest management, because it's typical with high conflict that trust and relationships erode, right? Communication channels erode. And so what we saw was that, to put it very mildly, environmentalists and the logging community could not see eye to eye with what needed to happen with forests. And that really ended up materializing in high rates of litigation. So there was really not much that was moving forward on any national forest in Oregon. So the Northwest Forest Plan was signed in the early 90s, which technically ended the timber wars. But there have been ripple effects from decades, as you would imagine with any sort of major public controversy such as that. And we're still living within the legacy of the timber wars. So the DCFP did not just sprout up out of nothing right then and there. It took a long time to build the relationships and trust necessary to form the Deschutes Collaborative as we know it today. So that materialized in a way where there was a lot of community-based, small-scale collaborative efforts in the late 90s, early 2000s in Central Oregon. These were primarily based out of the Sisters area, but they were usually singular issue oriented. So maybe it was a recreation project that the Forest Service was pursuing, and community groups would come together and collaborate with the Forest Service. And then it got a little bigger, and some more iterations of collaborative groups emerged, taking on more complex collaborative problems. All this to say, there was a lot of groundwork between the early 90s and 2010 when the DCFP was founded that really was just building relationships, building trust in between stakeholders, and building trust in between stakeholders in the Forest Service, very importantly. So in 2010, the Deschutes Collaborative was formed, and there was a recognition that our stakeholders disagreed on most things, but it was important to come together and identify where we could agree, where they could agree. And it's those areas of agreement that sort of sketch out the boundaries of social acceptance for what happens on public lands. So when you can get all these diverse stakeholders to say, I love this, or maybe I don't love this, but I can live with this, the rates of litigation, the rates of just general social conflict decrease. And we've seen that here in Central Oregon, where litigation rates over Deschutes National Forest projects are practically zero at this point. And all that really has to do with relationship building and trust building. And much of that has to do with the work that the DCFP has done over the last 15, 16 years. So the Deschutes Collaborative, we're a nonprofit organization. We are a collaborative resource management group working closely with the Deschutes National Forest to ensure holistic management. That means incorporating diverse social, ecological, and economic values into their treatment plans. So we have a steering committee, which is essentially our decision-making body, and that has 23 seats representing 11 constituency groups here in Central Oregon. And this is the list here in the middle. It ranges from forest products to environmentalists to wildfire professionals to local government to tribes and many more, right? So we're bringing all of these interest groups together, again, to identify where we don't agree, but more importantly, work towards identifying the areas where values do align, where we do have synergies, or where trade-offs are acceptable. And then this is the point where I have a shameless plug of inviting participation in the DCFP. We're a nonprofit organization, and all of our meetings are open to the public. And in particular, we want folks that are interested, that love the forest, that are passionate about these subjects to come and contribute to the conversation, because ultimately that's what makes our body of work, our contribution to the Deschutes National Forest, all the more valuable, and our agreements, our recommendations more durable and more robust, is when we're hearing from a diversity of community members holding a diversity of values. So all this to say, come join us if you're eager to participate in something else. We're here to help. Last quick thing, the Deschutes National Forest is our primary partner. They are not a member of the Deschutes Collaborative. And that's an important thing to note, because we're a community organization that is speaking on behalf of community values. So while the Deschutes National Forest is engaged and participating in every conversation that we have, they are not decision makers in our space, right? They inform the conversation, certainly. They are experts in many, many ways, but they're not decision makers. So everything that comes out of the DCFP as recommendations are not driven by the Deschutes National Forest. I'll just touch on this briefly. This gives a little bit more nuanced breakdown of what I mean when I say holistic management. So when we're having conversations about forest treatments, whether that's a particular project or on the landscape scale, our group is trying to balance all of these outcomes, whether that's access to first foods and ceremony, cultural ceremonial locations, management of riparian areas, community wildfire defense, old growth defense, right? All of these things, all of these values are present when we're having these conversations. So that's a little bit about the DCFP at a very high level. Really what the bulk of this presentation is about the fundamentals of forest restoration. What does it mean? What's going on when trails are closed? What are you seeing when you're out there hiking or biking or whatever you may be doing in the forest? So the DCFP, as I mentioned, has been around for about 16 years. And at the beginning of our time, there were no agreements in place of what we collectively want our forest to look like. So we needed a starting point. And while I was not involved at that point, the group, logically, in my opinion, went with the best available place-based science and said, well, what did the forest look like pre-white settle? So 200 plus years ago, this was a self-sustaining ecosystem, right? It didn't require active management. So let's nudge conditions back towards those. And what we would have seen if we were around back then was a forest that was dominated by large old trees, especially in the ponderosa pine, kind of lower elevation areas. We would have seen a much more open forest than what we see today. We would have seen a grassier understory, scattered shrubs, certainly, but more open and grassier. And extremely important is the presence of fire on the landscape. This is a fire adapted ecosystem that we live in. These ecosystems were managed by fire for millennia. And so, especially in these ponderosa pine forests, we would have seen fire returning to any given area approximately every 15 years, extremely frequently. Now, that goes up, the duration between fire goes up as you go up in elevation, but all this to say, this is a frequent fire, frequent disturbance ecosystem. That's how it evolved. So if we think about the Deschutes National Forest that we know today, this forest pictured here is a good example. It's much, much more dense than what we would have seen historically. It also has what we call high fuel accumulation, right? So that could be downed wood like you see in this picture. That also could just mean a lot of really big shrubs, right? All of this is fuels. That could mean live trees, right? It's very, very dense. There's a lot of fuel that can burn. So these are the conditions that we're facing today, and the conditions that the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project is wrestling with, how to nudge these conditions back towards those historic conditions. We include this slide of a stump here, particularly because of the story that the rings tell. So as you probably know, the distance between rings indicates how much growth a tree has year to year, right? And so the farther apart they have, the more growth it has, the closer together, the less it grew. The less it grows is primarily indicative of resource competition and or stress. And so what we see in a lot of the stumps out here that are being cut down is a significantly smaller amount of growth in recent years as opposed to when the trees were younger. And that is because the forest is becoming more and more dense. There's more competition for resources, light, nutrients, and water.
I was just gonna ask you, when you say recent years, what's that parameter? Are we talking decades, multiple decades?
Yeah, multiple decades. Yeah, so there's probably a rough guess of 25 to 30 years pictured just on this outer, I don't know, sixth of the stump there. And it's a really significant slowdown compared to the distance between rings there towards the earlier years of the tree's life. This just roughly guessing that's probably, a 90-year-old tree. So in the past 20, 30 years, as the forest grew in, we're seeing a lot more competition. So what do we do about that? How does restoration? Oh, the one last piece here with the tree rings is important to note is that post restoration, and I'll get into the details here in the next slide, is we see a significant release for the trees after the area has been treated. So what that means is we see significantly more growth by the tree after treatment has occurred, which indicates improved tree health. It has more access to water, sunlight, and nutrients. It's that simple. So what are the phases of restoration? There are four primary phases. The first is non-commercial thinning. So this is usually done by hand crews, so done taking out the teeniest, tiniest, smallest saplings, limbing the branches, really kind of clearing out the area for the more intensive phases of restoration to come. But it's necessary because a lot of these areas you couldn't walk through, much less get any machinery into if this phase didn't happen first. So this is basically the dealing with all the woody debris that has no commercial value. The second is what garners a lot of attention, and that is the commercial portion of restoration. And this is really dealing with thinning out the canopy. We call it strategic thinning because according to whatever the prescription that the Forest Service has come up with, that's vetted through NEPA, contractors will go out and take those trees that have been determined to be less fit or simply need to come out. Now, thinning operations, there's a wide degree of what you might see in terms of intensity, and that's all going to be condition specific. So that's going to depend first and foremost on what the Forest Service plan is going to allow contractors to do in the forest. It's also going to depend on how many trees are out there that have commercial value. It will also depend on what additional work needs to happen in the project area, because the thinning, the logging that happens is the only profitable part of the restoration process. So if there are riparian restoration needs, if there's soil mitigation needs, if there are, road and trail decommissioning needs in the area, none of that makes money. All of that costs money. And the money that comes to fund those comes from the trees that leave. So all this to say, this is a very important piece. It garners a lot of attention. It brings in the funds necessary to do these other pieces of restoration. And there's ecological value to thinning out the area generally. The third phase is the treatment of the understory. So this is traditionally referred to as mowing and mastication. So this is just dealing with, again, the fuel that is in the understory. So grasses and large shrubs. And what they're trying to do is to break up fuel continuity. And this is in line with what we would have seen with historic conditions, where absolutely grasses and shrubs existed, but they did not exist continuously, completely throughout forest. Right, there were breaks, and those breaks helped to moderate the intensity of fires that would come through. So that's what this does. The most important phase of restoration is the application of prescribed fire. Fire was the original manager of the landscape before there was ever a Forest Service, right? And so fire is the most ecologically appropriate and economically efficient way to restore forest conditions to historic conditions. And the reason that the three preceding phases are necessary is to set safe conditions for the application of prescribed fire, right? All of this is done in order for land managers to get fire back on the ground. That is critical. So prescribed fire oftentimes looks shocking and looks scary. And one of the things that we hear about frequently is how bad areas look post-prescribed fire. So this photo here on the left is just 1 week after prescribed fire. And what you'll notice is, the ground, the understory is black, wall to wall. But in order to assess and really see the impact of prescribed fire, you need to look at it on a longer timeline. And so 1 year after prescribed fire, you already see a greener, grassier understory. You also start to see the reestablishment of shrub, and you also start to see some saplings returning, right? So very, very quickly, we do see the ecosystem responding to fire. It certainly doesn't kill everything forever. You look 5 or 6 years later, and there is a really heterogeneous understory. There are gaps, there are patches of shrubs, there's downed wood, great for wildlife, and we have a great native grass understory that has reestablished. Now, while 6 years to us is like all of high school plus a half, right? It can be a long time. To a tree, 5 years, that's nothing, right? So very, very quickly in ecological time, in tree time, we see really rapid response. And what this ecosystem is doing is responding very quickly in preparation for another fire that would naturally occur here in another 10 years. Maybe less, maybe a little bit more. So if we return to what we expected the historic conditions to look like, and we compare that to what the post-restoration conditions look like, it's not an exact match, but you can start to see the similarities. You start to see the bigger trees that anchor the system and start to dominate the area a little bit more. You can tell an older ponderosa by the color of its bark and the size of its plates, and we see much more of that now. We also see a better distribution of size and age of trees, right? It's not just all old or all young. We see young trees, we see middle-aged trees, and we see old trees in these areas. The spatial arrangement is also, again, more heterogeneous. You'll see bigger gaps, which allows for different shrubs, flowers, plants to return to the area. You'll also see clumps of denser trees break up sightline, their thermal cover for wildlife, right? These micro habitats, microclimates are super important for forest biodiversity, and a biodiverse forest is a healthy forest. What you'll also notice is the significant lack of fuel loading, especially compared to that first photo, or I guess it was the second photo that I showed. And really what we would expect when it comes to wildfire here is natural fire, not if, but when it returns to this area, to be able to move through this space much more safely than it would have with the denser conditions, right? And this is a piece that I think sometimes gets miscommunicated, is the resulting conditions from restoration do not prevent wildfire. That is not the intent of treating the forest. The intent is to restore conditions to naturally accept fire, because historically fire was omnipresent on the landscape. And so these conditions don't prevent fire from starting. Lightning, a cigarette, a campfire, this will go up for sure. But it's a matter of how the fire acts after lighting. That's the piece that's significantly moderated. And this brings us to good fire versus bad fire, a term that you might have heard. Beneficial fire might also be a term that you've heard. So when we talk about good fire or bad fire, what people are really talking about is the intensity of the fire itself. So in the foreground of this photo, you see a really excellent example of low intensity fire. So this is fire moving across the ground. Really all it's consuming is the needle cast, the pine cones, the grasses, and the shrubs. In the background, which is a little harder to see because of the smoke, is a better example of moderate intensity fire. And that's fire that's going to come through and cull some trees that are stressed, trees that are young, trees that are maybe diseased. It will take out some trees. But you compare that to the high intensity fire that's becoming so much more prevalent across the landscape. I mean, July is already such a horrific example of this. And this is a fire that is uncontrollable and it is ecologically devastating. Now, what I don't want you to think is that high severity fire was never present on the landscape before white people arrived. Right. High severity fire is part of the natural cycle as well. But the difference between then and today is the frequency of fire and size of these fires.
How do you know that?
How do I know what?
Yeah, where does that information come from? That's what fire was like 2,000, 200, 300 years ago.
Yeah, they're actually we do a lot of partnership. A lot of the science that we rely on comes out of OSU and their forestry department. And so, and I can get you some of the methods. I don't have that on the top of the brain, but we worked very intensively with a researcher who's part of the faculty now, named Andrew Merschel. And he was doing core sample studies on a lot of the trees that were logged. So these would have been old growth trees when Brooks Scanlon was heavily active in the Bend area, in the Central Oregon area. And what that was showing was you can tell by the rings, there will be scars on the trees that can show that I'm not sure exactly how the researchers know this, but there are scars that will show when and how intense a fire would have been. So it is certain that there was a whole variety of intensities of fire that moved through this landscape at different points. We also know that lodgepole pine, for example, it naturally grows really, really dense. It grows super fast. They stay really skinny and they stay really dense. And those are forest types that are prone to high severity fire. So we know that by the scars from the stumps that are left over, but we also just know that from a botany standpoint, that the conditions that lodgepole puts itself in is prone to high severity fire. So there's a number of ways. Everything that we do is based on, it's a balance between place-based science, best available science, and social, economic, ecological values held in our community. Does that answer your question? So this is, I think, kind of the best story in photo form that we can tell. So this is a photo of the Sican Marsh. This is a Nature Conservancy property down on the Fremont-Wainema Forest, so south of us. And back in 2021, I don't know if y'all were around in Central Oregon then, but the bootleg fire ripped through the Fremont-Wainema, and I think it ended up being about 180,000 acres. High severity fire, fast moving fire. And the top third of this photo shows an area that had not received any treatment. The Nature Conservancy was actively pursuing restoration strategies, but they had not gotten to every acre on their property. And what's left is, frankly, a moonscape. And that is going to take centuries to recover. There's no seed bank up here. There's no seed source. So in order for forests to reestablish in those areas, it's going to need to slowly move in from the treed boundary, right? Down at the bottom here is an area that had only been strategically thinned. And while there's certainly more left in the thinned area, so the fire intensity was likely lower, many of these trees are going to die. Most of those needles are dead. It's not going to be able to photosynthesize. We will lose a lot of those trees. But you do see some trees that have some green and may survive that fire. So better results, but still not good. The middle third speaks for itself. And that is an area that had received fire on the ground recently. And I mean, the picture really speaks for itself. An example, these are additional photos from the Sican Marsh property. So these are areas that were either untreated or thinned only. And this gives you a better idea of those fire impacts that I was talking about, where fire that came through the thinned only stand. I mean, I won't talk too much about the untreated because it's all dead. But the fire that came through the thin stand was less intense, right? It didn't burn everything off, but it still burned hot enough to kill those trees. And you compare that with closer up photos of areas that had seen prescribed fire, low and moderate intensity fire, and we have mostly surviving trees. These trees are adapted to fire. They can take fire, but they can't take high severity fire. An example closer to home comes from the Darlene 3 fire in 2024. This threatened the community of Lapine, and this photo is taken probably a half mile from the city boundary. On the right side of the photo is an area that was not treated, had no treatment applied. And on the left side of the photo is an area that had seen the full suite of restoration treatments, including prescribed fire. The fire in this case did jump the road. So it came from the right and did enter the area on the left. But again, the trees speak for themselves. The intensity of the fire on the left-hand side is indistinguishable from the intensity that we saw on the right. And this is what we typically see. And there's example after example after example, both from the stories that firefighters tell from their time in the field to scientific research, where we see high intensity fire meeting an area that has fuels treatment and prescribed fire, and the fire will drop to the ground. And it drops to the ground because there's nothing to bring it back up into the tree canopy. And even if, say, a spark jumps from the right side of the road to the left and lit one of these trees in the canopy, the spacing is such that it's much, much harder for that fire to spread quickly and violently. So what we'll hear firefighters say all the time is, yep, it met this unit and it fell on its face because it comes here completely vertical, and then it hits its face, and it may continue, but it continues on the ground. These photos are taken from the exact same location, but just looking out in. And again, we can see, a year and a half after this fire occurred, the response. We still have plenty of living trees in the treated side and all dead trees on the untreated side. So the DCFP generally supports forest management and restoration activities, but that's not a carte blanche, a signed empty check for the Forest Service to do whatever they want, because forest management needs to be about more than just wildfire protection. That is a huge component. That's something that we live with every single day. But if everything is only treated for fuels, then that's not meeting the needs of all these other community members. And so in that way, the collaborative plays an essential role here in Central Oregon, where we help to provide the feedback by weighing trade-offs, by identifying synergies between these social, economic, and ecological values that are always present when we're talking about landscape management. The final piece here is that not all values can be present on every acre of land. So if you walk out into the forest and try to evaluate, is this area equally good for wildlife as it is for fire defense, as it is for recreation, you probably aren't going to see an exact balance. So in order to assess the balance of values, you need to look at the landscape scale and say, across all of the work that the Forest Service has done and is doing, are we seeing that balance? And that's how the Deschutes Collaborative evaluates balance across the landscape. It's not on every acre. It has to be at a wider scale. I like to kind of finish the forest restoration piece with a quick point about the need for all possible solutions, especially when it comes to community wildfire defense. Quite frequently, what I'll hear are people saying, well, We don't need to be doing, forest management work. We need to be investing in home hardening, defensible space, and these other urban centric methods for community wildfire resiliency. The Deschutes Collaborative's stance on it is, why would we not do both? These are not mutually exclusive. There are clear ecological benefits to landscape management. There are wildfire benefits to landscape management. And we also know that our urban centric methods make a difference as well. So we do not see these two approaches as mutually exclusive, and we advocate for all possible routes to be taken. One method is never going to be enough, especially with the wildfire crisis that we're all living through. So I have a couple of projects that I wanted to highlight, but before I do, I'll take a quick pause and see if there are any questions here about the forest restoration aspect. Okay.
Do the surrounding counties have similar projects?
Like as to the Deschutes Collaborative?
Yeah.
Yes and no. It's not as much based on county as it is national forest. So there are many forest collaboratives that exist throughout Oregon, many who are just as longstanding and mature as the DCFP, and many that are, newer. So yes and no.
About the Deschutes National Forest.
The Ochicos did have a forest collaborative. It has, since disbanded. I know that there are efforts to look for ways to kind of reignite that collaboration. But as of now, the Ochico Collaborative is not operating. So a couple of quick projects that will help to kind of ground what I mean when I say we're bringing stakeholders together, we're building consensus, we're building a shared vision. So one of the pieces that we were routinely seeing, where we were seeing conflict arise routinely, were between wildlife advocates and recreation advocates or enthusiasts. We know from a body of science that human presence is generally negative for wildlife. And this can be at varying degrees, but it's generally negative. This could be a deer getting hit by a car and dying. It could be just scaring an animal and moving them away from a really valuable piece of land where forage is available, right? And so there are gradations to this, but generally speaking, we can say with certainty, human presence, bad for wildlife. We were seeing this come up consistently with forest plans where there was this conflict arising, where Central Oregon is increasingly dependent on recreation and tourism, and therefore access and additional recreation and access infrastructure development is necessary on the forest to meet that greater need. We also know that makes conditions worse and worse and worse, fragmenting forest for wildlife. So not only are they going to be driven off or killed more frequently, they also are not going to be able to link intact functional habitat with other patches of intact functional wildlife habitat. So we partnered with the Deschutes Trails Coalition to collaborate on a project and say, okay, these values are seemingly at loggerhead. What are we going to do? Where can we agree that the forest should be managed in this way to balance both? And we started with this map, which depicts the areas that are unfragmented by roads or trails. And what we see is a very heavily fragmented landscape. Additionally, what this map does not show are any user-created roads or trails. And so this is the most optimistic scenario that we can provide, but we know it's not realistic. And so knowing that there's so much fragmentation, we asked ourselves, how are we going to go about this? And what we did was we convened a series of shared learning opportunities where we brought recreation stakeholders, wildlife stakeholders into the field, into the classroom for presentations. We had discussions, we had workshops, and I don't think I have images of these here, but partners at the Nature Conservancy built a connectivity model that essentially linked these areas where we anticipate more functional, better wildlife habitat to exist, which accounts for fragmentation, and maps connectivity across the landscape to give ourselves a better idea of, if I was a wildlife species, how might I move to this other functional place? And so that gave us a starting point to say, okay, if this is how wildlife are likely to move across the landscape, now we can focus in on these areas that are most important to restore first, most important for recreation. And through this process of workshops and consensus building, we were able to develop a set of recommendations and a toolkit of strategies that community members, whether they were equestrians, mountain bike riders, bird watchers, etc., were able to agree to. And essentially, the group carved out a structure of 3 priority areas, recommending to the Forest Service that in their planning process, they use a model for thought where they designate areas that receive treatment that prioritize wildlife habitat. In other areas of those project areas, they should be prioritizing recreation expansion, really concentrating recreation in particular areas so that we don't have sprawl. The same way we don't want urban sprawl, we don't want recreation. And then a toolkit for how we mediate the areas in between. What tactics should they use to strike a better balance? So in this way, we hope to, over the next number of years, see a better balance struck. And what this is going to look like is road decommissioning, defragmenting of the landscape in priority wildlife areas. It's also going to be the construction of new trails in priority recreation areas. And it's going to be the very strategic decommissioning in areas or rerouting in the shared matrix. This is a small scale, but I think a really good example of that work in action. In the West Bend area, there was a user-created route, and you can see the dashed gray line right here. That was a previously decommissioned road that very, very quickly, maybe even the next week, users had reestablished as a trail instead of a road. And in the West Bend area, it's a high recreation area. There are not a lot of large patches where animals can be distanced from humans. And so the Deschutes National Forest, partnering with the Central Oregon Trail Alliance, worked to reroute this user-created trail, which actually struck a wonderful balance, the exact balance that we were looking for when we were building our agreements, because the new recreation opportunity is actually better than what was there before. It added scenic value. There's a viewpoint now. It's a more fun riding and running experience. And it increased the size of this patch by, about a fifth, which is significant in an area that's significantly fragmented. So this is really what we're talking about. And while this example here, this is not going to move the needle for elk. This is not going to move the needle for mule deer. But when we, again, look at it at the landscape scale, and we can see the aggregate impacts of a lot of these actions, a lot of these decisions, now we're hopeful that we're going to see a better balance struck on the landscape. So I do have another. I'm going to leave it here. We engaged in a big prescribed fire project. Happy to go into more depth on that if you guys want to talk about prescribed fire. But that's what I have for you today. Happy to chat more. Always happy to have folks come join us at our Deschutes Collaborative meeting. So If there are questions, happy to answer those now, or discussion points, thoughts. Always happy to engage.
Thanks for what you're doing. I mean, it really makes sense. I'm sure there's a lot of old opinions that resist the fact that just books and stories about how the Native Americans were doing this and the settlers were saying, you can't do that, you can't do that.
Right.
And they just do more because they've lived there for generations.
Yeah, absolutely. And the landscape was prepared for sort of fire. They knew when and where to put it. I mean, indigenous knowledge is extremely valuable when we're talking, like there's not just one knowledge system that contributes to, the scientific body and scientific understanding. And I think that's something that's lost generally, is the inclusion there.
I like the idea where it's not, do we have fire or not have fire? It's, yes, we live with fire, but we control it so it doesn't destroy our ecosystem. So yeah, that's perfect. I love that.
Great.
How are y'all funded?
We're funded from a variety of sources. We get federal funding, so we do have some agreements with the Deschutes National Forest and with Region 6. That accounts for about 35% of our funding. We also get funding from the state of Oregon through the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And then we have a number of county and local funders as well. So Deschutes County funds us. We have a partnership with Visit Bend. There are private foundations and private grants that we're awarded. So it's from, all sectors.
When they do those controlled burns, does the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project get their name on it when the press goes out so people know that this is a controlled good thing? I mean, do you guys reach out publicly and
So this is entering more into Sarah's realm of our operations, as she does our outreach and public communications. But typically, no, we're not an implementation based organization. So I am not going to be on the ground with a drip torch putting fire on the ground as much as I'd like to. That's the Forest Service's job. And so typically, like, we're not going to have our name, our brand on that. Our role is really to set the social conditions to allow an increase of pace, scale, and quality of prescribed fire. So what that looks like are conversations like these, where we'll go around routinely with community groups to answer questions, address concerns, and say, hey, this is why prescribed fire is so necessary. And so while it is inconvenient that your favorite trail might be closed for a season, or there might be some moderate smoke impacts in the spring. This is why we believe, as a collaborative, those trade-offs are necessary because of all these benefits that come from prescribed fire. So we're really more on that public communication realm or the conflict resolution realm, where we wouldn't be like branding a prescribed fire hours per se.
I know the weather window changes, but is there like a times of the year that you guys really focus on? Is it like early spring? Is it late fall?
Yeah, it's all going to be conditions based, but yes, spring is the prescribed fire season. There are two primary types of prescribed fire. There's underburning, and also maybe called broadcast burning, and pile burn. So in the spring, underburning, the conditions are the most appropriate for underburning. It's going to be the safest. And what they're looking at is plant moisture content, soil moisture content, and then prevailing winds and pressure systems. And that's how they make the call of go or no go. There are windows, and you will see underburning or broadcast burning in the fall, but that window in Central Oregon is just very, very tight. It's either way too dry or way too wet, and that change happens like that. It's like it's summer and then it's snow. So like they may get like one, but the conditions appropriate for pile burning, which are far easier to contain, so they'll do that in the fall and the winter time, because they'll keep the operations rolling and conditions aren't appropriate.
And that was your first picture where they go in initially and they clear it out and stack everything up.
The let's see. this is an example of a broadcast burn.
Okay.
So this is where, and actually this is probably a better
Yeah.
photo where, yeah, you'll get crews that come around and they just have these big jerry cans of gas and they're putting a line down. They also there are different technologies. They're starting to utilize drone technology to put spot fires,
Oh, really?
which is actually a lot more beneficial because it helps with the mosaic effect, right? When you have these spot fires occurring and kind of spreading out until they stop, right? That adds to the ecological benefit. So that's sort of how they'll do it. The piles themselves, I don't know that I actually have a photo of the piles, but if you're out in the forest, you'll see those.
Yeah.
And those can range from, piles the size of this table to really large piles.
I have 1,000 questions.
So that's also nice.
I've also seen where there's gigantic piles of juniper, and I was reading that juniper's been around for thousands of years, and it mainly stayed up in the mountains. But because of cattle grazing and everything else, all the native plants are gone, so the juniper's popping up everywhere. And then I've seen these ginormous piles of cut junipers, and I'm guessing that's to try to turn it back naturally or save the grouse apparently that's getting pushed out by it.
Yeah, the trees
Get involved in that.
So there's not a huge population of juniper like dominated area. There's not a large swath dominated juniper area in the Deschutes National Forest, at least current. So frankly, no, it's not a conversation that we have to engage in too much. As conditions change, I anticipate that there will be a need to have those conversations. I do know some about it. The sage grouse are not necessarily pushed out by the trees themselves, but the trees provide perch for predators, and that's actually really what harms the grouse. The juniper are natural in our sagebrush steppe ecosystem, but historically they wouldn't have been as prevalent because of the existence of frequent fire.
Yeah.
Junipers are not very resilient to fire.
They explode.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when a fire moves through, it typically will take out the juniper. So
Yeah.
where you'd see, old juniper is where there had been fire exclusion, whether naturally or otherwise. That's a piece that's always kind of difficult to describe where juniper is native to the region, but its population and its presence has exploded. It's a lot of straws in the ground, and there are all these, issues with water consumption and these other pieces like wildlife concerns that you bring up. Yeah.
All right.
Mhm.
Thank you very much.
Great, I need to, Jen and people were actually here. She talked about West Juniper, this sounds.
And I'll check the website. I'll be able to get to it on this.
It
Okay.
should be, yeah, and it's another YouTube, but
Okay.
yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
So it's a fantastic, she was so enthusiastic to talk about junipers and had a very unbiased view on it. It changed my perspective on junipers. And so, yeah, I highly recommend it. It's on our YouTube channel.
I actually talked to Jenna yesterday to be like,
Yeah.
I gotta make sure that I know what I'm talking about with the juniper. Is this right? And
Yeah.
she's like, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And then she told me a lot of things that I went over my head, but she's excellent and a great resource. And I use that to plug Oregon State Extension Services. I mean, they are fantastic resources. They operate all around the state, so it's certainly not just expertise for Central Oregon. And it's across the board. It's from forest product utilization, really creative ideas for juniper reuse, to management issues, to rangeland management across the board. So they're a fantastic source. We talk with them all the time. They participate in our restoration planning meetings, and Jenna's great.
Yeah. Fantastic. Cool. I think we should wrap up because
Sure.
it is 6.
Perfect.
But yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Mara.
Yeah, of course. Get out of this.
You're part of the collaborative. Yeah,